Herzlich willkommen zum Familientreffen. Liebe Buchfreundinnen und Buchfreunde, schön, dass wir endlich wieder nach 3 Jahren hier zusammenkommen können. Ich freue mich über den vollbesetzten Saal und die ganzen Menschen, die das Buch feiern wollen. Seien Sie alle ganz herzlich willkommen. Sie dürfen sich selbst klatschen. Wir haben einen ganz besonderen Gast unter uns.
We've got a special guest among us. You may know Austria is this year's host country, and it's a great pleasure for me to welcome the President of the Austrian Republic, Alexander van der Bellen, and his wife. A warm welcome to you.
Und jetzt nicht mehr klatschen.
And now, don't applaud anymore, because I will read an endless list, otherwise we wouldn't be able to finish. So I will summarize. Welcome, Minister Todorov from Bulgaria. State Premier, Mr. Kretschmer, welcome. Claudia Roth, nice to have you here. Ladies and gentlemen, members of different parliaments, a warm welcome to ministers among us, Mr. Bull-Wagner, Mr. Zille, excellencies, presidents, managing directors, and now you can applaud dear Maria Stepanova. And Ilma Rakusa, a warm welcome to the two of you, Ms. Stepanova, Ms. Rakusa. Ladies and gentlemen, publishers, authors, writers, exhibitors, friends of the book, at long last, it's high time. But at the beginning, of course, I have to be serious, because there is heaviness in the air as well. When you return to Leipzig, quite often I'm a great friend of poetry, and I will remember to read Children's Wishes by Bertolt Brecht. Houses shouldn't burn. Bombs shouldn't fall. The night should be for sleep. Life shouldn't be punishment. Mothers shouldn't cry. Nobody should kill another person. Everybody should build something. Then you can trust everybody. The young will achieve something, and the old ones will also achieve something. But what does madness in 2023 look like? Burning houses, sleepless nights in bomb shelters, crying mothers, tens of thousands of dead people, among them lots of children. On the 24th of February 2022, there was the news, the terrible news of the attack on Ukraine, a brutal war of aggression in Europe, and no end in sight. I would like to report from Leipzig so that you know what the reality is of this book fair. We have received more than 12,000 refugees from Ukraine. More than 10,000 have stayed in Leipzig, and many thousands of refugees from other countries. The city administration was brought to the limits of what they can do. But we have to thank lots of citizens in Leipzig that we have succeeded. And despite everything, tonight we will open the Leipzig Book Fair. But we will wonder, we will ask ourselves, what does war do to us? What does war do to writers, to authors? And what does war do to readers?
Im Umschlag des Gedichtbandes Mädchen ohne Kleider
on the cover of the book, Girls Without Clothes, and we celebrate Maria Stepanova for that book. It still says on the cover that Maria Stepanova still lives in Moscow. Now she lives in Berlin, in Germany. War has forced her into exile. She was the editor of Kolta.ru. A few weeks after the start of the war, the site was banned. She was one of the last independent bastions in that country. At the beginning of this year, Ms. Stepanova said in an interview with Jüdische Allgemeine that a few months after the outbreak of war, she was not in a position to write anything. She wrote a short cycle of poets later, but she will not publish it before the end of the war. This is impossible, as Russia doesn't even allow the word war. But she finds very clear words for the situation in her country. I quote, "What we can now experience is the end of the thinkable. The end of the thinkable. What remains is helplessness, despair," and in her book of poetry, Girls Without Clothes, that was written before the outbreak of the war, and it was also about helplessness. Always there are girls without clothes. There is always something eating away at them. Always something that remains. Always something that is gone forever. That's what she says in her cycle of poets. It's about helplessness of girls. It's about male power over their bodies. Maria Stepanova analyzes a power balance which keeps existing and which remains invisible. And of course, as a reader, you remember Russian imperialism, which Ukraine has fallen victim to. What does war to us? We read things in a different light. We concentrate more on reading in the context of war. And when you then read reports about sexual violence and rape, in this war, we award the book prize for European understanding to a Russian author. Congratulations, Ms. Stepanova.
Danke, dass Sie heute hier sind, dass Sie unter uns sind.
Thank you that you are among us. Our position is clear. We stand by Ukraine. We show solidarity. But it is also clear that we have to reach for dialogue, for diplomacy. And I deeply believe that a book trade fair has to be a place of dialogue, is a place of dialogue. For a long time, we are in a literary exchange and we are the interface with Eastern Europe. The list of award winners shows that from Poland, Romania, Hungary, Russia, Ukraine, and Ms. Stepanova will be at the exhibition center tomorrow and in Hall 4 at Coffee Shop Europe. She will discuss the past, the present, and the future. Ladies and gentlemen, we need places like that more than ever before. Places where we can speak, where we can discuss, where we can raise questions, where we can reach for answers, look for answers. I have the naive belief that literature can touch us, can move us, can grip us. And maybe it can help to overcome hatred and can be a sting in the flesh. Lots of writers suffer persecution because words are seen as weapons. Autocrats and dictators fear the motivation of people towards enlightenment and democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, may the book fair start. I hereby open the book fair.
Sehr geehrter Herr Bundespräsident Alexander van der Bellen, sehr geehrter Herr Ministerpräsident.
President of Austria Alexander van der Bellen, State Premier Mr. Kretschmer, Minister Claudia Roth, Andrea Mayer, Lord Mayor Burkhard Jung, Mr. Bull Wagner, Mr. Ziller, Maria Stepanova, Ilma Rakusa, colleagues from the book industry, guests. If an author of dystopian scenarios had told us at this point in 2019 that the following 3 Leipzig book fairs would fall victim to a worldwide pandemic, we would have shaken our heads and moved on to the joyous daily business of celebrating books. And yet, I have to look around, I have to make sure that my voice doesn't break. Oliver Ziller and his dedicated team made 3 attempts at organizing a book fair. 3 times they had to stop on the home stretch. I would like to take this opportunity to say to you, dear Mr. Ziller, but also to all those who fought with you, how much we all, and I personally, felt with you, and how enormously happy we all are to be here tonight at the Gewandhaus to celebrate the opening of the Leipzig Book Fair. But what has been missing above all else in these 3 years? The Leipzig Book Fair is traditionally the first big highlight of the book year, the first shower of attention for the spring novelties, and a huge festival of reading. It exudes book enthusiasm from the book fair booths to the city's pubs in the evening. But it's also a recipe for diversity of programs, opinions, points of view, an opportunity for small independent publishers who traditionally have a harder time in the retail trade, an opportunity for newcomers, which we need as much as any industry. And why is this diversity so fundamentally important to me, to the Börsenverein? Looking purely at the figures, one could answer, because 80% of publishers in Germany are small publishers with sales of up to 1 million euros. But that is too short-sighted. That is not the whole story. 175 years ago, brave people in Germany built barricades, following the example of the French Revolution. At considerable risk to life and limb, they fought for a democratic constitution. And even though the Frankfurt Constitution of St. Paul's Church then lasted only a short time, it became the basis for the Basic Law, which was enacted much later, after the darkest chapters of German history, against these advocates of democracy and a united Germany. Only soldiers' help against democrats was the Citerum Censeo of King Frederick William IV, the old Hohenzollern king. But what helps a democracy? At that time, this was not only the French model. The growing strength of the press, thanks in part to the high-speed printing presses that had become technically possible, improved communications, thanks in part to telegraph connections, and a vibrant book scene, thanks in part to book fairs, also helped to enlighten people, to enable them to form their own opinions and to become capable of debate. in this context two dates. 1825, 23 years before, 1848, the Börsenverein was founded here in Leipzig. 1834 saw the publication of the first Börsenblatt, the weekly magazine for the German book trade. Today we consider our free, democratic basic order to be as secure as we assessed the Leipzig book fairs of the following years in this hall in 2019. But the fact is, for the first time since 2004, the Bertelsmann Transformation Index BTI records more autocratic than democratic states in the world. Of 137 countries surveyed, only 67 are still democracies, while the number of autocracies has risen to 70. 67 to 70. Democracies are now outnumbered. More and more democracies are being deliberately ridiculed and undermined by authoritarian state leaders like Vladimir Putin. Democracy is hard work. Democracy is complicated. Democracy is no guarantee of individual happiness. But democracy is the only form of government in which people are granted the same rights, regardless of their origin, gender, education, and sexual orientation, in which everybody can freely express their opinions, and in which power emanates from the people. It is also the form of government in which art and culture flourish freely. I'm looking at you, Ms. Roth. So we should do everything humanly possible to stabilize democracy. And that brings us back to Leipzig. Over the next few days, books will be presented in the exhibition halls, and throughout the city, life concepts and models of thought will be presented. Debates will be initiated, and people will be able to form opinions. This is a commitment based on freedom of opinion, and a fundamental right on which we will once again be shining a spotlight throughout Germany starting next Wednesday with the Freedom of Opinion Week. But people can only do all that if they can read and want to read, and neither can be taken for granted. When 1/5 of elementary school graduates cannot read, when social background has a growing influence on reading skills, and all that in one of the richest countries in the world, then I can only say that politics has failed here, because reading is the basis for participation and economic success, not only for the individual but for society as a whole. Dear politicians at the federal, state and local levels, please realize that something is very wrong here, and act and help us change matters. The Leipzig Book Fair shows how reading and book enthusiasm can be communicated in a straightforward way. Another reason why it is so good that the fair is back. Here you can live and breathe books. Hardly any child, even those who know books at home, does not come into contact with book happiness here, and will have been sewing on their cosplay costumes for months. So all is well here in Leipzig? How can it be when there is war 1,500 kilometers away in Leipzig's twin city, Kiev? We always say it's been going on for 14 months, but in fact Russian soldiers have been attacking Ukrainians for 9 years. Putin declared war on Ukraine as a democratic nation and culture very early in his third term in office. We in the West turned a blind eye. Only soldiers help against democrats. That is also Vladimir Putin's motto, 175 years after Frederick William IV. As an industry, we stand by Ukraine's side. Through numerous initiatives and the great commitment of many, we try to provide practical and financial support to give visibility to Ukraine and the book industry, and to make its books more accessible to the world through translations. We show our solidarity and try to encourage authors, publishers and booksellers. We offer a platform to Ukrainian as well as exiled Russian voices, like Said Jadan, for instance, to whom we were able to award the Peace Prize of the German book trade in the Paulskirche, or like Maria Stepanova, whom we are honoring today with the Leipzig Book Prize for European Understanding. Russia's war of aggression on Ukraine And the horror we all feel about war in Europe must not make us close our eyes to what brave Iranian women are taking to the streets against, to what leads to drastic prison sentences in China, to a world in which the right to freedom of expression is trampled underfoot by steel-toed shoes in many countries. And yet I would like to conclude with a message of encouragement. And again, it comes from the Bertelsmann Transformation Index. I quote, "Around the world, civil societies are resisting authoritarian trends, often where governments failed in the pandemic. A remarkable strength of civic engagement and social solidarity emerged, helping to bridge gaps in government provision. Civil society stakeholders are often the last bastion in the fight against autocratization, as in Belarus, Myanmar, and Sudan. They vehemently demanded overdue social reforms, such as greater social inclusion in Chile, or successfully fought corruption and abuse of office, as in Bulgaria, Romania, or the Czech Republic. Currently, the greatest impetus for democratic innovation and renewal comes far less from governments than from critical civil societies." End of quote. And I would like to add, the greatest impetus come less from governments and more from book fairs, like the one we are opening here today. Thank you very much.
Sehr geehrter Herr Bundespräsident, lieber Alexander van der Bellen,
President of the Austrian Republic, Alexander van der Bellen, State Premier, Michael Kretschmer,
sehr geehrter Herr Oberbürgermeister, lieber Burkhard Jung, liebe Andrea Mayer, liebe Katja Mayer, liebe alle, die heute da sind, liebe Autorinnen, liebe Verlegerinnen, liebe Verlage, liebe Institutionen der Leipziger Buchmesse,
publishing houses, organizers of the Leipzig Book Fair. Nice to be here in Leipzig all together.
Wer ein Buch liest,
if you read a book,
eine andere Welt.
You enter a different world. That sounds enticing.
Diese andere Welt dann nicht eine sein, die uns mit ihrem
Shouldn't this
Elend
world
verschont?
be a world where there is no misery, no war, no hunger, no violence, no hatred, no destruction?
Uns nicht.
Literature
Das
doesn't
wissen
spare
wir
us. We
und
know that,
trotzdem
and
lesen
still we read.
Wir lesen noch mehr in einer
We
Zeit wie
read
dieser,
even more in a
in der
time
man
like
gern
this,
eine andere Welt betreten
where you would
die
like
Tür
to
hinter
enter a
sich
different
ins Schloss
world,
werfen wollte.
where you would like to
Wir
close the
lesen,
door on this world.
weil wir
We
kein anderes Mittel
read
haben,
because we don't
als
have
die
a different
Sprache,
means
um
than
zu
language
verstehen,
in order
uns
to
die Welt zu
understand,
erschließen, weil sie
in
es
order to
ist,
discover the
die
world,
Sprache, die die
because
Welt
it is
erschafft,
language
eine
which
ebenso
creates the world.
schöpferische wie abgründige Kraft.
Which is
Es
a
mag
creative
eine andere Welt
and
sein,
evil force
die
at
wir
the
in der
same time.
Literatur betreten,
It may be a
aber
different
es ist
world which we
unsere.
enter in literature,
Und
but it's
wer die
our
Leipziger
world.
Buchmesse besucht,
And
dem
when you
liegt sie
visit
zu
the
Füßen.
Leipzig
Die
Book
ganze
Fair,
Welt
it is
so,
at your
wie sie
feet,
ist.
the
Mit
whole
einem
world
Krieg
as it
mitten
is,
in Europa,
with the war
mit
in the center of
Klimakrisen,
Europe,
mit
with the
Hungerkrisen
climate
und
crisis,
dem Elend,
hunger
das sie
crisis,
hinterlassen,
and the misery
aber
they
auch,
leave behind,
auch mit
but
unserem
also
unbedingten Willen
with our
uns
willingness
Krieg und Unfreiheit,
to
Hunger,
fight against
Elend,
war,
Hass,
lack of
Gewalt
freedom,
und der
misery,
Zerstörung dieser
hatred,
Welt
violence,
entgegenzustehen.
and the destruction of this
Hier,
world, and to do
hier
something
in
against that
Leipzig,
here in
mit
Leipzig,
nichts anders als der
using
Macht des Wortes,
nothing
einem
but the
Werkzeug
power
der
of
Literatur
the
und der
word,
Demokratie,
a
mit der
tool
Kultur
of
der
literature,
Demokratie.
with the culture of democracy. I'm very happy, deep down in my heart, I'm very happy that after 3 years the Leipzig Book Fair can be held again. Because the book fair in particular is a bridge into a world which still needs rediscovering time and again. The literature of Central and Eastern Europe. The Leipzig Book Fair has always been a special celebration for readers, for authors, representatives of publishing houses. There is no better place than Leipzig, and there is no more important place. I would like to quote myself now. Well, sometimes you can indeed quote yourself. I will not allow this book fair to be taken away from me, not for anything in the world. End of quote. That's what I said myself. I said this in a discussion which we had last year after the cancellation of the book fair. And I stick to that. If we can now celebrate books again, then not as a continuation of the book fair of 2019. We will still use tried and tested formats, but also new concepts. For instance, the dual concept of the trade fair and Leipzig's reading, but also new formats, like the fair's bookshop tour through Austria, Switzerland and Germany, on which the fair brings together authors and readers in bookshops in 12 cities. The Leipzig Book Fair is a place of encounter. Over the next few days, visitors to the fair will be expected by 1,900 small, large and independent publishers, by exhibitors from 38 countries, especially the publishing houses from our host country this year, Austria. So a particularly warm welcome to representatives from Austria. Katja Gasser, you have to meet her, the wonderfully committed artistic director of the Guest Country Project, said in a newspaper interview a few days ago that average German feature writers loved it when Austrian authors hated their country. Fortunately, well, I tell my Austrian friends, we also have a few above-average German columnists and also German readers whose love of Austrian literature does not call for any self-denial. Clemens Setz has been awarded the Büchner Prize and the Heinrich von Kleist Prize, must have other reasons. And the wonderful novel Moons Before the Landing, that it is nominated for the prize at the Leipzig Book Fair, is thanks to its great and undeniable literary quality. Female authors like Birgit Birnbacher, the winner of the Ingeborg Bachmann Prize 2019, also win over readers with their powerful language and with their unmistakable language. And the same is true of the outstanding Russian writer and lyric poet Maria Stepanova, who is being honored today with the Leipzig Book Prize for European Understanding for her volume of poetry, Girls Without Clothes. One critic has described Stepanova's poems, congenially translated by Olga Radetskaya, has described them as highlights in the current concert of voices in world poetry. And this is not an exaggeration. but nothing but the delightful truth. I congratulate you, Maria Stepanova, with all my heart on this significant award, and I would like to thank for the wonderful truth of your poetry. Rarely has understanding been more important in Europe than today, as Putin's murderous war of aggression makes a mockery of any attempt at understanding. I'm truly delighted that our Ukrainian friends are represented here at the fair, and that cannot be taken for granted for a country that has had to defend its existence and culture against Russian invaders for more than one terrible year. And Ukrainians are not only defending their culture, they are defending culture as such, yes, also Russian culture, against hatred, intolerance, violence, and destruction. They also defend their language and their literature, which are the prerequisite for understanding among each other. Hölderlin wanted, and I quote, that a conversation we are and can hear from each other. And that is precisely what the Leipzig Book Fair wants and has always wanted to be, a conversation, understanding. With the Forum Open Society, the Leipzig Book Fair offers a platform for that. There, the question is discussed in what kind of society we want to live in today and tomorrow. And this kind of dialogue is more important than ever before. The readiness to listen, respect in society has diminished dramatically. Let's talk about democracy. The pen format is not just highly topical, and it delivers the goal of the debate as well, because talking about democracy can only succeed in the spirit of democracy, when you respect people who have a different opinion, recognizing free speech, and this is what we need. The Leipzig Book Trade Fair is a political place, and it has to remain a political place. We need the unfettered power of literature. What we need is the bravery of authors, of editors, of publishers. We need the power of art, which autocrats and dictators in the world fear. The Leipzig Book Fair happens a few days before the 10th of May. On the 10th of May, 1933, 90 years ago, the Nazis burned books, chased writers out of their country, chased artists out of Germany, murdered them. Today, books are burned in Ukraine. And it's also authors and writers who are persecuted in their countries. And we offer a platform to them. And this is what is so important about the Leipzig Book Fair. What is special about Leipzig and its book fair is that it is a festival of reading, a festival for readers. And in this year, we have a particularly dazzling array of goods. With the fantastic program, Leipzig is reading 2,400 events at 300 different venues in this wonderful cities, 2,500 players and participants. And this is unique. No other book fair in the world can offer such a dazzling display.
Und überhaupt nicht vergessen möchte ich
And not to forget, of course, the Manga-Comic-Con, which can be held as well. I'm very happy about that. I look forward to discovering new draftsmen and women, new comic writers, and I look forward to the costume visitors. And I look forward to your visit to our booth, the first BKM booth, the booth of our ministry. It's worthwhile to visit our stand. I would like to invite book traders, booksellers, and all 18-year-olds. Then we can introduce the cultural passport to them, which we will launch this year. So visit our stand, our ministry stand. I wish us all wonderful days, hours at the book fair. I wish you a lot of discoveries, a lot of adventures, and let us discover the world. Let us discover the world at our feet. Thank you very much.
Okay, kannst du mal Bescheid sagen? Geht gleich weiter.
Wie undankbar, nach so einer fulminanten Rede noch was sagen zu müssen.
So it's difficult to say anything after such a speech.
Liebe Frau Schmidtauer,
President of Austria,
Jung, liebe Frau Jung,
Alexander van der Bellen,
liebe Petra
Mr. Jung,
Roth,
Petra Roth,
heute wieder.
Claudia Roth even, as of today, Claudia Roth.
Sie sind alle noch dabei.
But you are still with us.
Meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren,
Ladies and gentlemen,
zunächst einmal, du hast dich schon selber zitiert, Frau
you
Claudia Roth.
have quoted yourself,
Möchte ich mich
Claudia Roth, and I would like to
das ist
thank you.
Ein Erlebnis,
This is
Oberbürgermeister,
an
was wir
experience,
schon miteinander
Lord
teilen.
Mayor, which
Diese
we share.
entschiedene Aussage, wir lassen uns die Buchmesse nicht
This
wegnehmen.
statement, we won't
Einer
allow the book fair
Kulturstaatsministerin, die
to
gerade
be
im
taken
Amt
from
ist
us.
und
A
die damit
minister
ganz
of
klar
culture
dokumentiert, sie weiß,
who
wie
shows
wichtig
in her
diese
office
Veranstaltung
that
für
she
den
knows
Buchhandel ist,
how
für die Verlage,
important this
wie
event
entscheidend
is
sie ist
for
für
the
die
book
neuen
trade,
Bundesländer,
for publishing
wie wichtig
houses,
diese
how
Tradition
important
von,
it is
man
for the
kann
new
sagen,
German
Hunderten
states,
von Jahren
how
ist,
important
und dass
this
wir das gemeinsam
tradition
hinbekommen, haben
is,
wir
which
dir
is
zu
hundreds
verdanken
of
und
years
deinen
old,
Mitarbeitern
and it's
herzlichen Dank.
thanks to you that all that has happened, you and your staff.
Dieses gemeinsame Agieren mit den Verlagen, mit der Messe
This
natürlich,
joint
mit
working
der Stadt und
with
auch mit
the
Carsten
city,
Schneider, dem
with
Beauftragten der
the
Bundesregierung für die neuen
trade
Bundesländer,
fair company
ist ein
and with
wirklich
Carsten
tolles
Schneider.
Erlebnis und
This is a
gemeinsam
great
haben wir das
experience
hinbekommen und
and we
es
have
zeigt sich auf
managed
diese Weise,
jointly.
die
It can be
Buchmesse
seen
hat
in
ihren
this way.
festen Platz
The
in
book
unserer
fair
Gesellschaft.
has
Diese
place in our
2000
society.
Aussteller aus über
The
40
2,000
Ländern
exhibitors
dokumentieren,
from
wie wichtig
more than 40
diese
countries
Veranstaltung hier ist.
show how
Und es ist ja auch
important this
gewürdigt
event
worden
is.
mit Leipzig
It has
liest.
been
Es ist ein
appreciated,
ganz besonderes
and
Format.
Leipziger's
Ein
reading
Format, was zu
is a
dieser
special
Bürgerstadt
format.
passt,
A
die so
format
sehr nach
which is
außen wirkt, die so
fitting
sehr
for
auch
this
Kommunikation
city,
möchte, die die Menschen
which is about
einbindet.
communication,
Eine ganz,
which
ganz
involves
besondere
people.
Art, hier diese Buchmesse
This is
zu
a
veranstalten.
special
Ich
way
bin
of
froh darüber,
organizing this
dass wir
book fair.
diese Veranstaltung
I'm
hier
very
wieder
happy,
gemeinsam eröffnen
that we
können.
can
Ich freue mich über
open
die
this
vielen
event
Gäste,
together.
die gekommen
I'm
sind,
happy about all
auch
the
gerade
guests who have
Gäste
come,
aus Österreich.
guests from
Noch einmal herzlich
Austria in
willkommen, Herr
particular, a
Bundespräsident,
warm
Ihnen
welcome
und
to
Ihrer
you,
großen Delegation und den
President of
vielen
Austria.
Verlagen.
Welcome
Für
to
den
your
Freistaat
delegation
Sachsen
and
ist es
many
eine
publishing
enorm
houses.
wichtige
For the Free State of
Veranstaltung,
Saxony,
weil
this
sie
is a
die
very
Gelegenheit
important
bietet,
event
miteinander ins
because
Gespräch
it
zu
offers
kommen
the
und auch
opportunity to
miteinander
talk to
über
each other,
schwierige Fragen zu
to
diskutieren. Heute
discuss
Tag
difficult
der
questions.
Sächsische Landtag und die Kollegen
Today
werden mir bestimmt wieder
there
Ärger
is
machen,
a
dass ich mich hier in
session of the
Leipzig
Saxon
rumtreibe.
Parliament,
Aber neben dieser
and
wunderbaren
my
Eröffnung
colleagues will mind
gab
that
es
I'm
heute
here
Nachmittag
in
eine
Leipzig.
Veranstaltung an der Universität.
There was
Junge
an
Leute haben
event at the
eingeladen
university,
und wollten
young
über das
people
Thema Gendersprache
invited,
sprechen.
people
Und
to
es war
discuss
ich fand
gender
schon
language,
beeindruckend, diese
gender
jungen
conscious
Leute zu
language,
erleben,
and it
denen
was
das so wichtig
impressive
war.
to see
diese
those young
Gleichberechtigung,
people
die auch die
for whom
Sichtbarkeit
equality was
der verschiedenen
important,
Formen von
also
Sexualität
the
möglich
visibility of
machen
different
wollten.
kinds of
Und auf der anderen
sexuality,
Seite
and on the
dieses
other hand,
Fragen, ist das jetzt
those
schon
questions,
der Weisheit letzter Schluss
is
mit
this
dem
the
Stern, mit dem
ultimate
Unterstrich, mit
wisdom
dem Gender
with the
Gap? Gibt es
asterisk
nicht noch was
and
anderes?
the underscore?
Und muss man nicht
Shouldn't there be something
diese
else?
verschiedenen Anliegen auch in
Shouldn't we
einen
make sure
Einklang bringen, in einen
that we
Ausgleich
bring
bringen?
all that together,
Natürlich
that we should bring
100,
all that
200,
in a balance?
300.000 Menschen, die sich nicht als
100,000,
Frau oder Mann empfinden.
200,000,
Eine Größe, die
300,000 people
durchaus
who
beachtlich ist und die
don't
auch
feel to be a
dazu
man or a
Anlass
woman,
gibt, sich ernsthaft mit der Frage
and that
auseinanderzusetzen,
is
wie wir
reason enough to look
in
into
der
this
Sprache
question,
auch diese
how
Menschen
in
sichtbar machen können.
language we
Auf
can
der
make
anderen
those people
Seite,
visible.
Sie haben es gesagt,
And
Frau
on the other hand,
Schmidt-Friedrichs,
you
es
said
sind
it, Ms. Schmidt-Friedrichs,
33% der Kinder in Deutschland in der 4. Klasse, die
33% of
Schwierigkeiten
children
haben
in
beim
4th
Lesen
grade
und bei der
have
Orthographie. In manchen
difficulty
Bundesländern wie Berlin
spelling
sind
and
es
reading.
fast
In
jedes
some German
zweite
states like Berlin,
Und
it's
der Rat für
almost
deutsche
50% of children.
der Rat für deutsche
And the
Rechtschreibung,
Council
der
for
die
German
deutschsprachigen
Spelling,
Länder und Regionen verbindet, also auch
which
Österreich und
links all
uns
the
hier in
German-speaking
Deutschland,
countries, so
der hat
Austria
seit
as
vielen
well,
Jahren immer
and
wieder diese
Germany,
Frage,
for
wie macht
many
man das? Wie
years
kann man das
has
tun?
asked this question, how can
Und
you
dass
do
dieser Rat für
that?
deutsche Rechtschreibung
This
sagt,
Council for German
wir wollen
Spelling
das jetzt gerade
says
nicht, es gibt
we
keine
don't want
historischen
that.
Gründe,
There are
warum
no
man diesen
historical
Genderstern einführen
reason
sollte.
why you should
Es gibt
introduce
keine
this gender asterisk.
orthografischen Gründe
There are
dafür.
no
Es
spelling
gibt
reasons.
die Frage, dass eben
There is
viele
only the question
Menschen, die
that
Schwierigkeiten
lots
haben
of
im Erlernen der
people
deutschen Sprache,
who
weil sie
have difficulty learning
sehbehindert
the
sind,
German
hörbehindert
language
sind,
because
weil sie aus dem
they are hard
Ausland
of
zu uns
hearing,
gekommen sind, weil sie
they
aus
have bad
vielleicht
eyesight,
bildungsfernen Schichten
they
sind,
are migrants,
dass
they
man
may
diese
not have had an education,
Form des Erlernens nicht noch schwieriger machen
that
darf.
you don't
Auch
make
das ist
this
ein
kind of learning even more
Argument und
difficult.
es sind,
That is
wenn
also
man
a
das so
valid
will,
argument.
20%
And if you like,
der Deutschen,
it's
die
20%
das
of
in irgendeiner Form
Germans
auch
who
betrifft.
are
Und die
affected by
Diskussion
this.
darüber heute mit den
And
jungen
this
Leuten, wie macht man das
discussion with
richtig?
young people, how
Und
can
wir
you
waren uns einig,
do it in the correct
wichtig
way?
ist keine Sprachpolizei. Man darf es nicht vorschreiben, man darf es nicht verbieten.
Shouldn't have
Es
a
muss
language
sich organisch
police.
entwickeln.
It has
Das
to
fand ich
evolve
ziemlich
organically.
gut, wie diese
And
jungen
I
Leute
like that
das so
idea.
gesehen
I
haben, wie sie
liked how
progressiv nach vorne
those young
gegangen sind,
people
aber trotzdem
looked
gesehen
into
haben,
the future,
es gibt viele,
but also
für die das
saw
schwierig
there are
ist,
lots of
die das
people
nicht
for
zu
whom
teilen.
that is
Und ich wünsche
difficult,
mir
who
sehr,
don't share that.
dass die
And I do
Leipziger Buchmesse
wish
auch ein Ort
that
ist,
the Leipzig Book Fair is a
auf dem,
place
an dem über diese Frage
where we
diskutiert
can
wird,
discuss
weil Sprache
this
ist lebendig,
question, because
Sprache soll sich
language
weiterentwickeln,
is alive,
auch in dieser
should
Frage. Es
develop
gibt
further.
berechtigte Interessen auf
There
beiden
are
Seiten.
interests
Lassen
on
Sie uns
both
die Gelegenheit
sides.
nutzen,
So let us take the
plural in diesem
opportunity
demokratischen
to
System
be
die Möglichkeit zu
pluralistic
nutzen
and to
und
make
nicht das
good
Kind
use of
mit dem Bade
the
auszuschütten.
opportunities which
Ich
there
bin-
are, and not to throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Ich bin sehr froh,
I'm
Maria Stepanova,
very
dass
happy,
Sie diesen
Maria
Preis bekommen.
Stepanova,
Das ist eine
that you will win this
große Freude.
prize. It's a great
Meine Damen und
pleasure for
meine
me.
Damen und Herren,
Ladies and gentlemen,
dieses gewaltige Unrecht,
this
was in der Ukraine passiert,
injustice
dieser
which
Angriffskrieg, und es
happens
ist
in
in vielerlei
Ukraine,
Hinsicht gesagt
this
worden,
war
dem
of
ist,
aggression,
kann man
and
gar
it
nicht
has
mehr
been said
hinzufügen.
several
Es ist genau
times
so.
already.
Es ist ein
I
großes
cannot add
Verbrechen, was da
anything.
passiert,
This
und es
is a
ist richtig, dass
big
wir uns
crime, a
engagieren,
terrible crime, and
dieses
it
Land
is
vor dem Untergang
right
zu beschützen. Es
that
ist auch
we
richtig, sich mit
try
ganzer
and
Kraft
protect
für Diplomatie
Ukraine.
einzusetzen
It's
und
also
möglichst
correct
schnell
to
das
ask for
Sterben zu
diplomacy
beenden.
in order to
Darf
end
auch nicht dazu führen,
the dying and the
Wie hat
killing.
der Bischof von Coventry gesagt,
The Bishop of Coventry
diese
once said,
Nagelkreuzkirche, Sie wissen das alle,
you know the
an
cross
der
of
am Ende des
nails,
Zweiten Weltkriegs, nachdem
where
die
at the
Deutschen
end
die
of the
Bischofskirche
Second World
zerstört
War,
haben,
after the
geschrieben
Germans had
stand,
bombed this church,
Gott,
and it says
vergib.
on the wall, God
nicht Gott,
forgive,
vergib ihnen,
not God forgive
die den
them,
Angriff gemacht haben, nicht Gott,
forgive
vergib uns, sondern
those who attacked or
Gott, vergib
forgive us,
uns
but
allen.
just
Lasst
God
uns versuchen,
forgive
in die Zukunft zu gehen.
all of us.
Die
Let's look
Nikolaikirche,
ahead into the future.
Bundespräsident, Sie haben sie heute
And
besucht, ist
St.
eine dieser
Nicholas Church, you
Nagelkreuzkirchen, dieser
have
Friedenskirche, die sich ganz
visited
besonderer
St.
Weise
Nicholas
dieser
Church
Botschaft
today.
verbunden fühlt.
It is one of
Bischof von
those
Coventry sagt, in
churches
dieser
of the
Zeit
cross of
geht es
nails.
vor allen Dingen darum, und
The
muss unsere
Archbishop
Aufgabe
of
sein,
Coventry said,
den Hass,
it is
der
our
durch so einen Krieg
task
immer entsteht, nicht noch weiter zu
make sure
befeuern,
that there isn't even more hatred which is created by a war like that. We have to preserve what is human, difficult as that may be, when people are dying, when children are dying, when culture is destroyed. We are not at war with the Russians. There is a dictator, there is a war criminal, and we have to distinguish between this dictator and the people in that country.
Und wir haben keinen und wir wollen auch keinen Kulturboykott. Das ist absolut richtig, gemeinsame Haltung der Bundesregierung und auch von uns. Im Gegenteil, wir wollen den Menschen, die in Russland eine andere Meinung haben, einen anderen Weg gehen wollen, immer wieder zeigen, es gibt uns, wir sind an eurer Seite, es besteht die Chance auf ein Gemeinsames. Und meine Damen und Herren, das ist so schwierig, weil wir hier in Leipzig das Zentrum für europäische Pressefreiheit haben, eine Institution, die wir auch gemeinsam tragen mit BKM, mit der Europäischen Kommission und
which
wir hier im Freistaat Sachsen tolle,
do
wunderbare
together
Leute,
with the
die das
European Commission, and there are wonderful
und die
people
Gespräche
here in
mit den
Leipzig.
Journalistinnen und Journalisten, die geflohen sind aus
Talks with the journalists who have fled Russia before Putin. All that is very moving. Those discussions are moving. The discussions with Ukrainian journalists.
Die aus Weißrussland sind. Aber was auch bedrückend ist,
also Belarus needs to be mentioned. But apparently, even though it's not so many groups, it's tragic that we cannot get them to a table. And this is very tragic for me as well. I wish you a wonderful trade fair. I wish you lots of happiness and nice to be together in Leipzig.
Ich kürze mal die Anrede ab, wenn ich darf. Exzellenzen
I will make it brief. I'll make the addresses brief. Excellencies of all kinds.
Liebe Leipziger,
citizens of Leipzig.
Ein bisschen schwierige Rolle jetzt für mich, weil eigentlich wollte ich über Literatur sprechen.
Because I had wanted to talk about literature.
Was ich halt das Wenige, was ich davon verstehe, wollte ich mit Ihnen teilen. Also Österreich ist Gastland bei der diesjährigen Leipziger Buchmesse und als Gast bringt man normalerweise etwas mit, ein Gastgeschenk.
You bring a gift. In Austria we would say a buckle, Austrian dialect. So a wonderful collection of Austrian literature and their writers. The authors, the really important people at such a trade fair, the authors, namely the writers.
Sage ich einmal, es handelt sich hervorragende Literatur, was anderes.
Let's say it's great literature. This is what you would expect from me. But I'm not objective and not neutral in this point.
Also schauen wir mal, was ein weniger befangener deutscher Kritiker vor rund 3 Jahren geschrieben hat.
Unbiased German critic wrote 3 years ago in a bestseller about good style in literature.
Ich zitiere.
I quote.
Österreich ist literarisch ein Unikum.
Austria is unique, literary speaking. It has a tenth of the German population, but it has lots more authors than would be allowed statistically.
Ja, ich habe auch gelacht.
Well, I also laughed at first.
Das Problem ist, Ich meine, das ist ironisch gemeint, das ist schon
this is
klar.
ironic,
Aber
this is clear.
es ist auch klar, dass
But it's
Literatur sich
also
nicht um
clear
irgendwelche
that
statistische Erlaubnisse schert.
literature
Aber
is
was
not
wird da
about
eigentlich verglichen?
statistical
Steht da nicht im Hintergrund der
permits,
Gedanke,
but what is being compared?
es handelt
At
sich
the background, there is the
dieselbe Sprache
thought,
beim
well, it's the
Sprechen
same
und
language
Schreiben.
when people speak and write.
Weil wenn was von Haus aus unvergleichbar ist, dann kann ja
So,
Statistik
if
machen.
you cannot compare things, you cannot engage in statistics, percentages, 10 here, 10 there. So, do we speak the same language in Austria and Germany when speaking and writing? And this is contentious ever since Karl Kraus, at least in Austria. So there are lots of strange things in Austrian literature, so I recommend a feature in today's Süddeutsche Zeitung. Many examples of differences you find in that feature. I talked to German entrepreneurs in Austria who obviously speak the same language. And they said it's not easy. Very often you don't know your way around with Austrians. Let's say you want something and an Austrian politician will say, well, let's see. I can only tell you, this doesn't mean anything. This can mean I will look after it tomorrow, but it can also mean no, no way, I will shelve that. It's a bit like the Chinese. The Chinese don't like saying yes or no. They basically circumvent that and paraphrase that. So what is strange about Austrian literature? I came across a hypothesis that the long time of the monarchy, where there were lots of languages, the Habsburg monarchy, that is, will have played a certain role, and that is interesting. For instance, at the Reichs Parliament back then in Vienna during Habsburg times, half a dozen languages must have been spoken at least, but without simultaneous translation. If you didn't understand something, well, bad luck. You will have asked your neighbor, did you understand what that guy said? At the European Parliament today, at least 20 languages are spoken, but with simultaneous translation, and this is something altogether different. The other day, President Duda visited me in Vienna. He was born in Krakow. That was occupied between 1772 and 1819, so almost 150 years. Austria has a good reputation in Poland, in Krakow. So as far as our kind of occupation is concerned, what was interesting, around 1895, there was the situation in Vienna where the most important ministries, today you would say at a federal level, but back then it was the Reichs level, at the Habsburg Empire, everybody was from Poland. The Minister of the Interior, Exterior, the Minister of Galicia, the President, everybody was from Poland. With Emperor Franz Josef, they will not have spoken Polish, so they must have been multilingual. Multilingualism was normal back then, at least in those circles. About Franz Kafka, it's said that Czech syntax had an impact on his German texts. And today in Austria, there are lots of bilingual authors and writers who speak Slovenian and German, both as their mother tongue. And that will have an impact on your way of writing, on the shape of writing, style, content of the text.
In diesem Zusammenhang möchte ich noch auf ein lachen Sie mich nicht aus, aber
don't laugh.
Oder lachen Sie mich aus.
Or do laugh, I don't mind.
Auf ein verwandtes Sprachphänomen hinweisen,
There
das es in
is a
Deutschland auch
language
gibt,
phenomenon
aber
which
vielleicht
also
nicht
exists
in der
in Germany,
Intensität wie in
but not with
Österreich.
the same kind of intensity like in
In
Austria.
Österreich aufzuwachsen heißt,
To grow
für
up in
jeden,
Austria
für jede,
means
dass man
for
anderthalbsprachig
everybody,
aufwächst.
it means you know 1.5 languages.
Zweisprachig wäre vielleicht zu viel
So
gesagt.
bilingual would be too much.
Das heißt
So 1.5
irgendwie,
languages.
Als
So
ich
that
klein war,
means
hat man
when
geheißen,
I was small,
hat man mich geheißen, red nach der Schrift.
I
Also
was
sowas
told,
Ähnliches wie Hochdeutsch.
speak as you write, so
Aber
like
daneben
High
lernt man
German,
eine andere Sprache,
but you
nämlich den
learn
lokalen
another
Dialekt.
language,
Ich
namely
persönlich
your
verwende
local
den Ausdruck
dialect.
Dialekt ungern.
I
Ich
don't
finde, da
like
hat
the
so was
word
Pejoratives,
dialect
etwas
because it
Abwertendes.
sounds a bit
Für mich
pejorative.
sind es in der Regel
For
zweite
me,
Sprachen.
it's a second
Ihre eigene
language
Färbung, eigene
with its
Regeln,
own color, its
teilweise
own
eigenes
rules,
Vokabular. Sie
sometimes
sind
its
Teil
own
dessen, was wir
vocabulary.
sind, wo wir
A
herkommen,
dialect
man
is
erkennen.
part of
Also
what
ich
we
kann
are,
jedenfalls
so you
in
can
Österreich
tell where
sofort
somebody
erkennen,
is from.
ist er aus
I can
Ostösterreich
tell
oder
if
aus
somebody
Tirol.
is from
Und Sie werden
the
sofort
Tyrol
erkennen,
or
ist er aus
Eastern
Leipzig
Austria,
oder aus,
and you will be able
keine
to
Ahnung,
tell whether somebody is from Leipzig
Hamburg von mir
or
aus.
from Hamburg, let's say.
Die reden anders,
So they speak
sind aber dann
differently,
vielleicht auch anders.
and they may be different.
In einem anderen Kontext habe ich mir mal
In a
hingesetzt und
different
überlegt,
context, I
fällt mir
sat
ein
down
kurzer Satz ein, der nicht
and
sinnlos
I was
ist
thinking,
und
can
den
I
schon
think of a short sentence which still
in
makes
der
sense?
Sprache, in der ich groß gewachsen
In the
bin,
language I used
man
when I
vorsichtig
grew
sein,
up,
nämlich mit
but
meinen
have to be
Freunden am
careful
Dorf.
with my friends in my village.
fällt mir ein Satz ein,
So I
den wir schon in
can
Innsbruck in der
remember
Landeshauptstadt
a
nicht verstehen.
sentence which you
Ich
cannot
spreche
already
vom Kaunertal, da
understand
bin ich aufgewachsen,
in
das ist ein
Innsbruck,
Bergdorf.
the capital
Weit
of
genug
our state.
hineingehen
I
oder
grew up in
vorankommen zum Gletscher,
Kaunertal,
wenn Sie den Gletscher überqueren, sind
and
Sie in Südtirol.
it's near a glacier. When
Und
you
in die Schweiz
go
ist auch
over
nur
the
eine halbe
glacier, you
Stunde
will
im
be in
Auto.
southern
Also
Tyrol,
in den Bergen in
and it's
Tirol,
only 30
weit
minutes
außen
to
da
Switzerland.
rundherum.
So, in this village in Tyrol, high
Mit meinen
mountains
Freunden habe ich
surrounding
die
it.
lokale Sprache gesprochen.
So
Mit
with
meinen
my
Eltern natürlich
friends,
nicht, weil die hätten
I
mich nicht
spoke the
verstanden.
local language, but not to
Meine
my
Eltern haben
parents. They
untereinander
wouldn't have
entweder Russisch
understood
oder
me.
Estnisch gesprochen.
They spoke
Mit mir
Russian or
Deutsch.
Estonian among
Hochdeutsch.
themselves, but to me they
Also, was
spoke
ist der
High
Satz,
German.
den ich mir einfallen habe lassen?
So, what is this short sentence?
6 Worte.
6 words.
Fährt ich
Fährt ich,
für mich
for me,
wie Nacht.
wie Nacht.
Fährt ich für mich.
Fährt
Wie
ich,
Nacht.
für me, für Nacht.
Strengen Sie sich gar nicht an.
So, you don't even have to make an effort. Don't make an effort.
heißt ganz
Don't even
einfach,
try. This simply means
Letztes Jahr ist für mich wie
last
gestern.
year is like yesterday for me.
Fährt heißt letztes Jahr.
Fährt
Nacht,
means
das
last
reine
year.
A.
Nacht,
Nicht Nacht. Nacht. Das
Nacht.
reine A ist
So the
gestern.
pure A, this is
Vornacht
yesterday.
ist vorgestern.
Vornacht
Vorfährt
is
ist
the day
vorletztes Jahr.
before yesterday, and Vornacht is
Aber nur zur Beruhigung.
the
Auch
last
in
plus
Innsbruck
one year.
versteht es praktisch niemand.
but even in Innsbruck, nobody would understand this sentence. So
Insofern war ich sehr,
fear not.
fand ich es wirklich toll,
So
dass
I
das
thought it
Motto
was
der
great
diesjährigen,
that this year's motto, this
also das
year's
Motto eigentlich des
slogan
Gastlands beim diesjährigen Auftritt hier
of
in Leipzig bei der Buchmesse,
Austria, the guest country,
mehr als wie mir.
is mehr als wir mehr.
Haben Sie auch ein bisschen
That's this
gezögert,
year's
oder?
motto. I take it you didn't understand this
genau
when
ist
you
hier
first
gemeint?
read
Was
it.
genau
So
gemeint ist,
what does that mean?
Lassen wir das
Mehr
dahingestellt.
als wir mehr. So let's leave it at that.
Auf Kaunertalerisch würde man nicht sagen, mehr
In
als
the
wie mir.
Kaunertal
Wir würden
Valley,
sagen,
we wouldn't say that. We would
Mehr
say
wie mir.
wir, mir, wir.
Das hat politische Konsequenzen.
So
Ich kann
that
mich an
has
einen
political
Wahlkampf erinnern,
consequences.
wo
I
die
can
FPÖ
remember
als unsere
an election campaign where the
eher auf der
FPÖ,
rechten,
where the more right-wing party, where the FPÖ, the more right-wing party,
also jedenfalls, wo die FPÖ plakatiert hat,
where there
daheim
were
statt
posters,
Islam.
Daham
Es
statt
klingt in Wien
Islam.
gut, daheim statt
So,
Islam, ja.
home
So,
rather than
geht
Islam.
im Kaunertal nicht, weil
In
daheim ist
Kaunertal,
nicht daheim,
people
sondern
wouldn't
daheim.
understand that.
Und daheim
People would
statt
say,
Islam,
Dahom,
das geht
Dahom statt Islam wouldn't work.
Geht nicht.
So, it wouldn't work.
Aber es ist nicht nur eine Frage des Dialekts, und in Österreich
it's not just a matter of dialect. In Austria, and you will have noticed as well, the Vienna group is famous, which after 1945 has revolutionized local literature, and where dialect was used in avant-garde literature, and dialect was not a symbol for backwardness or romantic homeland lyricism, but became the peak of the literary modern language. And this is a rehabilitation of regional peculiarities. You can see
in Deutschland auch,
that it will be the same in Germany, but does it play the same role like in Austria, namely dialect, local dialect? When a citizen from Lustenau in Vorarlberg, and the local dialect calls it Luzhno, if that person wants to talk to an old villager in eastern Styria, they will not use their regional dialect because they wouldn't be able to speak to each other. They will use an artificial language, namely High German from Austria. Yes, really. Does that have consequences on how writers and authors write in Austria? Maybe.
Ist es nicht zuletzt, finde ich, verrät mir jetzt. Tatsache ist schlicht und ergreifend in den letzten 15 Jahren
over the last 15 years, Austria got the Nobel Prize twice. Elfriede Jelinek and Peter Handke, two Austrian writers, won the Nobel Prize for literature. I'm innocent in that. Thank you very much, but I'm innocent. But I noticed that in several cases, Elfriede Jelinek, for instance, but also Thomas Bernhard, or Anna Bahr, who is much younger, originally had professional musical training, not literary training. I don't know whether this is a mass phenomenon in Austria or whether just a handful of people are affected, because Austrian music, you know. Elfriede Jelinek and Peter Handke, two beacons, but despite that radiance, you cannot overlook that dozens of authors from Austria are part of the present canon of literature. But what strikes you, as you know, I used to be an economist in an earlier life, so lots of those young authors published their first books with Austrian publishing houses, which are not very big, and as soon as authors become well known, they will change over to a German publishing house. Okay. It's not easy for our publishers. You find somebody who is a really good writer. Well, it's a bit ungrateful. It's a bit of an ungrateful role. So, at any rate, I would like to thank our Austrian publishing houses for their role as scouts. And I would like to thank all book traders, all booksellers for their skills, for their expertise, for their ideas. When you enter a good bookshop and you start browsing, somebody asks you, you get talking, you can tell immediately, and this is true for almost all booksellers, that they live and breathe books. And hence we had the idea to take along 4 guests who are not presidents. So bring along 4 guests, not all of them from Vienna, namely 4 bookshop apprentices, so that they can get to know people, that they can participate in a trade fair. And on the train, which was a 7-hour train journey from Vienna, very comfortable, by the way, and on the train we started talking how they hit upon this trade, what they are interested in, what they are reading at the moment. And sometimes I'm reading myself as well, late at night. We've all got a problem with time. But I've been able to read a book or two, 600 pages.
Also, Melanie Tadic, ich lese kurz
Melanie Tadic, Klare Großebene, Eileen Üstün, and Colin Harp. Those are our 4 bookshop apprentices, book trade apprentices from Austria. And last but not least, I would like to thank all organizers. I would like to thank all organizers of the guest country project. Thank you very much, and you represent all those who have worked behind the scenes so that we could present Austrian literature here. So thank you very much. And now I conclude. I would like to thank all those people who at the end of the day have created the basis that we can meet in this fantastic concert hall. I'm here for the first time, and that we can talk about literature. By having created this literature, I would like to thank all authors, all writers. Thank you very much.
Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren,
Ladies and gentlemen, Maria Stepanova, Дорогая Masha. We may admire the 3 cycles in Maria Stepanova's new book of poems as absolute highlights in the current concert of voices in world poetry, wrote the late poetry connoisseur Michael Braun about the book of poems Girls Without Clothes, and Natascha Freundl commented on RBB culture. Stepanova listens very carefully to the words, shows their propagandistic, violent potential, while remaining in intensive dialogue with Russian and Western world literature, conveying an anti-imperial, unheroic Russian, a language without a claim to power. This year's Leipzig Book Award for European Understanding goes to a poet, a Russian Jewish poet who has lived in Berlin since the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, because she deeply condemns this war and no longer sees a place for herself in Russia. A poet who has published numerous volumes of poetry, essays, and the memoir In Memory of Memory, and was editor-in-chief of the independent cultural portal kolta.ru until the outbreak of the war. Maria Stepanova's name is known internationally. She has lectured and guest lectured in the US and has won prestigious awards for her books. And indeed, the term world poetry fits hardly any contemporary lyricist as well as it does her, who dialogues as a matter of course with Homer, Dante, and Shakespeare, Goethe, Rilke, and Celan, Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, and T.S. Eliot, Osip Mandelstam, Marina Tsvetaeva, and Joseph Brodsky. Quotations are cicadas, said the world poet Mandelstam. In Maria Stepanova's long, multi-layered poems, they sound loud or quietly, seriously or ironically. It also happens that the poet doesn't quote but paraphrases. Goethe's Earl King sounds like this in her work. Who rides so late through pond and stream? Soon he flies, soon he chases, soon he sleeps in his beard. The carriage rattles and roars, the boy is feverish, he moans. Fear not, my child, no harm will come to you. Let the wind whimper quietly in the sedge. The heron calls, the crane is silent. Soon we will be home as always. In the bosom it is dull, under the heart it is warm. In the hoof print, the trembling puddle. Let it say, look, it's day already. Pale star above boy's cap. But there in the dark deep under the moor, the earth water springs up from the rock, returns from the penal colony, is already up to the knees of the chairs. The word penal colony makes one sit up and take notice, as does the tone, which alternates between absurd fairy tale and pastiche. Stepanova's version of Earl King can be found in the poem cycle Spolia from the volume The Body Returns, which Olga Radetskaya, like all of the author's books, has translated magnificently. The Latin word spolia here means fragments, which Stepanova has incorporated into her poems, which brings us to the central theme of almost all her books, memory, which sifts through, collects and sorts fragments of personal and collective history in order to place them in new, unfamiliar contexts and snatch them from oblivion. This is a complicated and painful undertaking, especially since Russian history in the 20th century was essentially a history of violence, the traumas of which were officially suppressed in favor of a heroic narrative, right up to the banning of the human rights organization Memorial by Putin. Stepanova's main driving force is justice, is the ethics of compassion, in particular to bring the forgotten dead back into the light, to make them visible. She has dedicated her book in memory of memory to this rescue operation, a large-scale research into the traces of her ancestors by means of photos, letters, and diary notes. Life stories are pieced together in fragments, and behind everything the era appears, threatening even where it suggests normality. Stepanova masterfully works with puzzle pieces, constantly subjecting her actions to examination and reflection, not without questioning some current developments. What good are images in an age of digital overproduction and manipulation? After all, in their corridor of mirrors, not only the dead, but also the living are in danger of getting lost. How can the dignity of the individual be saved, be rescued over time? In a dialogue with Susan Sontag and Roland Barthes, with Ossip Mandelstam and W.G. Sebald, Stepanova attempts to grasp today's crises. Not an easy task, that, but Stepanova's open, creative approach makes it immensely exciting. However, the author sees her main task in counteracting the state's falsification of history, even if it is by writing epitaphs. The epitaph, or name plaque, puts all those in the right who fell victim to oblivion as displaced persons of human history. Especially as a lyric poet, Maria Stepanova creates memory spaces and raises the dead into our consciousness. In the cycle, the body returns, she runs through the alphabet in reverse order from Z to A to counter the creation alphabet of the Danish poet Inger Christensen with the Resurrection Saga. They all come back. I quote, "The Roman woman with a carelessly piled up flaxen hairstorm, the man who sold the shiny plastic flying things, an arm buried by the Marne, an arm buried near Narva, an arm lying in the Galician marshland, an arm of ashes lying nowhere. It all returns someday, and the crutches, like staffs of Peter, put on green shoots. A furor of tenderness drives these verses that want nothing to be lost. A storm of sensuality sweeps through the words and metaphors. I quote, "Lazarus, come away from there. And where's the sting? I'll get it out. And if there is still a splinter somewhere, we'll get that too." Yes, there is this self-confident tone in Stepanova's poetry, defiantly resisting the scandalon of death, the offense of death, and there are occasionally teasing tones when the Russian goose is rhymed with rosary. They do not take away the seriousness of it. On the contrary, for poetry, she says somewhere, is an absurd, many-eyed being with many mouths that lives in many bodies at once. The crucial thing is to take the rope away from the neck of the words, which poetry is best at. Poetry. In her 2015 cycle, War of the Beasts and the Animals, written in 2015, Stepanova takes aim at the war in the Donbass, satirizing state policy in a bitterly ironic tone. I quote, "On my entire territory, a crash course in history is starting. Foxes are barking at the blocking brigades. At all polling stations, jackrabbits are casting their votes in solidarity, and even the barnflies have interrupted their meal for the purpose of tactical circling in the sky. Where language is at a loss for words, she stammers." I quote, "We are not the ones. We are the ones who, we are like animals who are marching." Since the brutal Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, Maria Stepanova has subjected herself to radical self-analysis in essays. Out of an existential disturbance, she wonders what she could have done to prevent this madness. I quote from her essay, "The Russian Question," published in the FAZ newspaper. I quote, "The war has torn down all our former certainties about ourselves and leaves no stone unturned in our future self-understanding, our self-description. After Bucha and Mariupol, our individual stories are in one big bag, and they will be seen in the same light. But perhaps the stigma, the painful mark of collective complicity, will one day become the point where the journey from a blind we to a society of sighted eyes begins. This can only be accomplished from within." At this point, I would like to call out to Maria Stepanova. Dear Masha, you have been a seeing eye for a long time. Otherwise, how could you have written your poems, which contain so much world, so much sense of responsibility and poetic beauty, which transcend borders, open manifold resonant spaces, and are full of forebodings? Take the volume Girls Without Clothes of 2022. The eponymous cycle is about the voyeuristic pornographic gaze to which naked girls are exposed, foresters and hunters on the hunt for game, photos as bait, a universal problem. Stepanova's empathy comes into play where she does not depict, but slips into the girl's skin, tenderly, sympathetically, with attention to detail. In the second cycle of the volume, Clothes Without Us, an elaborate wreath of sonnets, she turns empty garments, which sensually and elegiacally refer to their former wearers, into a symbol of dying and becoming. I quote, "Show the clothes stripped to the ground, teach them to become earth, where what was nothing is suddenly the world." Sentences that one does not forget so quickly, especially in a time that sacrifices the weight of materiality more and more to diffuse virtuality. In the third cycle, Are You Air? The lyrical eye turns to the dead mother in 33 four-line stanzas, by conducting an elementary search for traces. Searching for traces is almost everything in Stepanova's work. Archaeological excavation in private and collective archives, in the ruins of history, in blighted landscapes. But it is even more about anthropology, about the human being in its uniqueness and dignity, which confronts us from graves and legacies. Maria Stepanova is a magical transformer. She turns the small into the big into the small. A walk through the field sometimes leads into the depths of history. Cosmic connections are revealed from sweat stains, dust balls, and lint. In her latest volume of poems, a winter poem written between 2020 and 2021, pandemic isolation becomes the time vertical dialogue with Ovid, exiled to the Black Sea, not without nasty potshots at the old and new rulers who fertilize the local black earth with the buttermilk of cultural imperialism and cruelly punish anyone who does not want to be a federation subject, an object in the arms of a territorial annexation. Sometimes with broad, sometimes with fine brush strokes, sometimes in a folk song tone, sometimes with philosophical reasoning, Stepanova explores the human condition without neglecting its Russian variety. We read poems reminiscent of epic songs and marvel at their timeless modernity. Paradoxical as it may sound, in Stepanova's work, past, present, and future are superimposed, as are lament and defiance, mourning and hope, original sound and quotation. In the process, a rare form of beauty emerges that contains its own truthfulness. Put it to the test, dear audience. Read Maria Stepanova, discover the worldliness of her poetry, a poetry that makes understanding possible in Europe and beyond, because she embodies it in the best sense of the word. Thank you very much.
Bitte Entschuldigung, ich mache das zum ersten Mal und habe in der Sekunde gesagt bekommen, dass die Urkunde Englisch ist.
Sorry, I'm doing this for the first time. The certificate is very long and in English.
2023 goes to the Russian poet Maria Stepanova for her unconditionally poetic approach to viewing the world. Her work firmly rooted in the present and in the Russian language of poets such as Alexander Pushkin, Osip Mandelstam, and Marina Tsvetaeva, while also providing a space where one can hear the echoes of world literature and feel the presence of Dante, Goethe, and Walt Whitman, alongside Ezra Prout, Inga Christiansen, and Anne Carson. In her cycle, Girls Without Clothes, from the volume of poetry of the same name, she seeks to protect the female body from the imbalance in power between observer and object. In the series of poems entitled Kleider ohne uns, Clothes without us, she playfully draws on lyric forms to create a perfect wreath of sonnets that portray clothing as a life code. In her circle Bist du Luft, if air, she enters the kingdom of the dead just as she did in her magnificent novel In Memory of Memory, where she intertwined her own family history with a retrospective look at the reign of Stalin and the fall of the Soviet Union. Her lyrical self speaks to an open grave and becomes immersed in the landscape of her childhood. Deep in the earth lie the battlefields of the 20th century and the bones of the dead. Alongside her prose and essays, Stepanova's poetry addresses the subject of remembrance. She follows the tracks of the unnamed dead and uncovers untold events while taking ironic turns and avoiding the use of any kind of war cries. Although Maria Stepanova writes about the depths of humanity in her poems, she also uses her language to provide great hope by giving a literature voice to non-imperial Russia that deserves to be heard right across Europe. Und jetzt bitte ich Sie auf die Bühne und Sie um einen großen Applaus.
And big applause for Maria Stepanova.
Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, I hope you'll be able to forgive me speaking in English in this wonderful evening. Esteemed ladies and gentlemen, dear members of the jury, dear guests, standing before you today, here and now, in this beautiful space is more than an honor. It represents hope. In the darkest of times, it happens sometimes that hope is the only thing we're left with, the only thing that separates us from decay, from moral and metaphysical non-existence. It can happen to individuals, to human communities, and to entire societies. All the more grateful we feel when it turns out that we are not alone in the darkness. We are seen and heard. Our voices can make a difference. Someone wants to make sense of what we are. Someone needs to understand. My voice can be heard now, and I am immensely grateful for that. Grateful to those who have done everything to make it discernible in the German-speaking world. To Surkamp, my publishing house, and to my wonderful editor, Katarina Rabe, to my incredible translator, Olga Radetska, and to the great Ilma Rakuza. Your presence makes me happy today. I am grateful to those who have read my books and written about them, and further, more broadly, to the German cultural sphere that still pays vivid attention to the text written in other languages and in other countries, a natural, necessary part of everyday life. And of course, to the experts and jury of the Leipzig Book Prize for European Understanding, those who made their choices in this year, the second year of full-scale Russian aggression against Ukraine. That is not only a merciful and courageous gesture, it is a call for understanding and also for distinction. I am bound by ties of birth and citizenship to a country that is now trying to drag Europe back in time, back to some mid-20th century point where the language of hate had tried to become universal. I also belong to those who write in Russian language, trying to reshape it in the name of the future, and as many of my peers, I do my best to resist the forces that misuse our language as an instrument of violence and death. I believe that the future of any language lies in multiplicity and uncertainty, in the fact that it never fully belongs to a state, nor a landscape, nor an ethnicity, changing and renewing itself along with everyone who wants to speak it or write in it, and do it in any country of the world. But what particularly moved and struck me about the jury's choice, a choice that is made, I repeat, in a black year of Europe, in a year of devastation, anxiety, and loss, is that the Leipzig Prize for European Understanding is awarded this year for the first time in its history for a book of poetry, for a poetic statement. What does it mean? For me, for you, for us, for those of us who turn today to texts, to the book pages, hoping to find there the possibility of something new, something that will renew us as well. Could it be that poems, with their limited audiences, their small print runs, their peculiar way of looking at the world and its wonders, that it might turn out to be important, even necessary, and precisely in times of war? Somehow today, amidst the overwhelming pain, poetry is the entity that keeps asking questions, reminding us again and again of the existence of the other, of the necessity of human connection, of European understanding, of understanding in general, and of the inconclusiveness of defeat. This is an ancient property of poetry. Its sonic nature provides it with a long-going echo. Not a single line of poetry exists in complete solitude. Not a line is ever written or conceived without a reply. It is both a question and an answer. It contradicts what other poets, predecessors, and contemporaries have said, and has no doubt that it will be heard and will continue into the future. But how exactly? Who knows? Perhaps as a detritus, a quotation, an example in an anthology, a specimen of dead language to which no more keys can be found, but more often than not, poems go into the future like dead grasses into the ground. They become humus, soil, the stuff from which other people's texts grow. Poems do nothing more than that. They talk to each other, they respond and correspond, they rhyme and quote. They become part of a vast worldwide conversation that never ends, even when this or that language goes silent or fades away. This sounds comforting and also hopeless. We'll know well enough that, I quote, poetry makes nothing happen. This line from Modern is quoted even by those who do not usually read poetry, and not without a reason. It gives us a full measure of human disappointment with ourselves, with our own kind, with humanity in general. And this disappointment was found in the disastrous 20th century. Today, when no one can any longer pretend to live in a post-catastrophic era, the catastrophe is back, looming large in our minds and our lives. This confession of our own powerlessness feels devastating. It was always there, the catastrophe, but for many it seemed that the small European world could stay safe and secure. Now no one can ignore it anymore. And what is there to expect of poetry? Is it of any use nowadays? Can poems even help in any possible way, prevent disasters from happening, make us better people, do something? Are they all they are ever able to do is the work of testifying and mourning. But is that ever even enough? Auden's lines were written in 1939, on the very eve of the World War II, and almost simultaneously with him, a Russian poet, Daniel Harms, was claiming that, I quote, "You should write so that if you throw a poem through a window, the glass will shatter." Harms himself died of starvation in the besieged Leningrad, in a prison cell in February 1942, and poetry didn't save him. Neither his own poems, nor Auden's, nor the whole bulk of poems written by mankind up to that day. The window didn't break, the prison remained intact. Likewise, poems written in our days, or back then, or at any given time, have not prevented Bucha and Mariupol and Bakhmut from happening, nor the bombing of Ukrainian cities and countless new deaths. While I write and speak in Russian, the Russian troops are killing the Ukrainians who speak Ukrainian, as well as the Ukrainians who speak Russian. The language of violence is international. To master it, it is enough to refuse to hear and understand the other humans. As I speak to you now, Yuri Dmitriev, the historian and the head of Memorial in Karelia, the man who made the past speak the language of the present, is serving a 15-year sentence in a Russian camp. Among many other political prisoners, jailed for attending a protest rally, signing a petition, reposting a joke, is Alexei Moskalyov, a person who was sentenced to 2 years in a colony because of his 12-year-old daughter, who drew an anti-war cartoon at class. The girl was sent to an orphanage, her father to prison. The language of historical facts is as dangerous for the Russian state as the language of images, so both become illegal. Democratic elections and the independent press, instead of being a regular element of one's everyday life, are perceived as criminal activities. The language that the Russian state speaks is the language of oppression and death, corruption and thievery, the matter of police protocols and judicial verdicts, the bleak tongue of continuous violence that attempts to wipe out any possibility of a future. I speak and write in a language that wipes out the lives of others, and in doing this, destroys itself. Many years ago, in his Bremen speech, Paul Celan spoke about how and at what cost he had preserved for himself the German language, his Muttersprache, his mother tongue in the most direct sense of the word, the language of his mother that he received as a gift in a cradle without doubts or reservations. The same language became instrumental in the destruction of his family and the world that surrounded him, partial in his mother's murder. This also was the language in which Celan continued writing. And was it even a choice for him? As he says, I quote, "Only one thing remained reachable, close and secure amid all losses. Language, yes, language. It was all he had left, a language that needed to be deconstructed, purified, and kept alive, a language that needed help to return to itself. In spite of everything, it remained secure against loss, but it had to go through its own lack of answers, through terrifying silence, through the southern darknesses of murderous speech. It went through. It gave me no words for what was happening, but went through it. End of quote. These words were written 65 years ago, and I will repeat them now in Russian. Beautifully translated by Boris Dubin. I'll repeat them in my native language, as I once read them in Moscow in a different era. Язык наперекор всему уцелел, однако ему пришлось пройти через собственную беспомощность, пройти через чудовищную немоту, пройти через бесконечные потемки речи, несущей смерть. German was not the first nor the last language that had to pass through muteness, through countless distortions, through impossibility of speech in order to become something new. But I am not in a position comparable to Celan's today. The question of choice now stands for many Ukrainian poets who write in Russian. Their home language turns out to be the language of an enemy, an idiom of death and aggression. Some of them decide to abandon it and write in Ukrainian from now on. That is a huge step, and I cannot begin to imagine the pain that stands behind it. But what to do if one has no such choice? But what to do if, when your language becomes a conduit of death, madness, barbarism? What if, like a laboratory experiment, it is deliberately infected with the deadly viruses of the past, and so the diseases of the past are spreading one by one across the world, like plague or black pox? Are we condemned now to reenacting the 20th century over and over again, its prisons, concentration camps, and propaganda machines, its trench wars and carpet bombings? What do you do when the fabric of language, its texture, suddenly gets transparent, and you see all the hidden layers of latent and overt violence stored inside and eager to come out? The only thing that helps, perhaps, is to know that I am not alone. The work of understanding, like the work of poetry, is never done alone. Celan liked an image that he borrowed from Osip Mandelstam, a poet he loved, a letter in a bottle addressed to a person that doesn't yet exist, a message sent into the unknown in the hope of attention, an important category for Celan, attention and understanding. The weightless threads of understanding that stretch between texts, between languages, between gaping voids, somehow, faintly, ever so slowly, they still stitch our world together, coming closer to one another, making links, establishing connections, mending the torn fabric. Attention and understanding, it doesn't seem much, but come to think of it, there is nothing more important for our words, or maybe for ourselves, now that the Russian language is becoming increasingly diasporic, the language of displacement, exile, and dispersion. It won't need to be representing any kind of norm, nor to be afraid of changes, agrammatisms, imperfections. It will live, as it happens, in the multi-voiced, multilingual space, together with Belarusian and Arabic, Farsi and Turkish, German and Armenian, moving back and forth between worlds and borders. All we need is a hope to keep the conversation on, to participate in a mutual, universal work of understanding, to be translated from the local to the worldwide. As you remember, Paul Celan saw little difference between a poem and a handshake, between thought and gratitude, between thinking and thanking, denken und danken. I am deeply grateful to everyone that has gathered here today for the rare joy of thinking together across languages, along and over poetry lines, and for the fact that even in the darkest of times, you can still answer a poem with a handshake.